Okay, in this video I will be discussing what happens to the market as supply and demand change. We have established in the course how we arrive at an equilibrium, price and quantity, and we found that this occurs at the equilibrium between supply and demand. Now, we don't expect supply and demand to remain in any given position over time. In fact, we expect supply and demand both to shift for various reasons. And so in this video, what I will be explaining is how we show a shift in either the supply or demand curves, what this means, and what this does to equilibrium values of price and quantity. Now, if you look at this graph here on this first page, we can see the historic price of a barrel of oil over time. We can see that for the most part, oil has been very volatile, say for the period of about the early 1900s to the 1970s. But as we can see, it's very volatile now as well. And the interesting thing about supply and demand is, as simple as it tends to be, we can use it to basically explain why oil has moved the way it has, and it does quite well. The theory holds up to the empirical data when you actually look at oil prices. So anyway, let's get started. Okay, so when we first start thinking about shifting either the demand or supply curve, we need to first go back and reestablish what we know about both the supply and demand curves. First thing is, when we say that demand or supply increases or decreases, we're discussing the entire curve. Recall the difference between demand and quantity demanded and supply and quantity supplied. Demand and supply are the curves themselves, and so if we say that demand increases or supply increases or decreases, this means that we're moving the entire curve. If price is to change for any particular reason, remember this is a movement along the curve, so changes in price do not cause shifts of either the supply or demand curves. We simply move along the curve to a new price if the market changes. So let's look at this upper left hand corner graph here, and in this graph we have demand increasing. So and we'll get to the reasons why the curves shift in a moment, but for right now this is what we do when we say demand increases. So the curve shifts up and to the right. You should notice that as the curve shifts up and to the right, we move from an initial equilibrium here to an equilibrium here. You should also notice that we move from an equilibrium quantity Q star to an equilibrium quantity Q star prime, which is greater than Q star, and an equilibrium price that moves from P star to P star prime, and again P star prime is greater than price. So we can say that when demand increases, equilibrium price and quantity rise, all else equal. Now that last part is very important. The concept all else equal is useful in economics when we want to isolate the analysis to a particular change. So for example, we will not often think about both the supply and demand curves changing at the same time. We will want to isolate one of the curves changing. And so what we say is, if the demand curve rises or if demand increases, then we expect equilibrium price and quantity to rise, all else equal, where all else equal simply means nothing else changes. So the only thing that's changing in the graph is the demand curve. And again, as we see, as demand shifts up and to the right, we increase equilibrium quantity and we increase equilibrium price. Now if we look at when demand decreases over on this side, we can see that the demand curve shifts back into the left. We have a reduction in equilibrium quantity. We also have a reduction in equilibrium price. So we move from this initial equilibrium to this new equilibrium, which arrives when demand shifts back into the left. And here we say that when demand decreases, equilibrium price and quantity fall, all else equal. Now if we look here in this graph down here, we're going to start talking about supply shifting. And again, we'll discuss why the curves shift here in just a moment, but for right now, we're just getting a handle on how we show this in a graph. Now, supply can be a little confusing, and you'll see why in a moment. So when we say supply increases, this in fact is a movement of the supply curve out and to the right. out and to the right. It's useful maybe here to not say down and to the right, as sometimes students want to say, because it does seem like we're going down. I think that unfortunately reinforces the incorrect notion that shifting the supply curve to the right is a decrease in supply. It is not. Shifting the supply curve to the right is an increase. And again, we'll talk about kind of what that means here in a moment, but just for our purposes, if supply were to increase, this is a shift out and to the right. We see that when the supply curve shifts out and to the right, we move from this equilibrium here to this equilibrium here, moving from Q star to Q star prime. So as supply increases, we expect quantity to increase, and as supply increases, we expect price to decrease. Again, all else equal. If we look here to the right, we have a situation where supply is decreasing, and this is a shift back into the left. And again, get used to saying back into the left instead of saying shifts up into the left, and this should help you remember that if the curve is shifting back into the left, it's actually supply decreasing. And so when supply shifts back into the left, it decreases. We move from this equilibrium to this equilibrium. This means a lower equilibrium quantity and a higher equilibrium price. And remember, when you draw these curves on assignments or exams, I'm going to want you to label them completely. If you don't label a curve or you don't label an equilibrium point, then in some sense what you're doing is you're not completing the analysis. And as I've mentioned in class, we learn concepts not as an in and of themselves, so we don't learn supply just so we know supply or demand just so we know demand, but we learn those two concepts so we can then use them to some other end. And in this particular case, we use it so we can better understand market dynamics as one of the curves changes over time. So in the next couple slides, we'll discuss, first off, why the curves shift in the first place, and then what causes them to shift. Okay, so first we're going to discuss why the demand curve shifts in the first place. And it's important to remember what the demand curve represents. And we've discussed how the demand curve represents the willingness to pay of consumers in a given market. And just sort of to refresh your memory, as we go up and down any given demand curve, these folks up here in the upper left-hand portion, they have high willingness to pay, and these folks down here in the lower portion of the demand curve, they have low willingness to pay. So the demand curve really is a representation of that idea of willingness to pay for a particular good. Now, if the demand curve were to increase, what you want to think about this is that the market demand for a given good is increasing. And what this means is that the willingness to pay for the good is also increasing at any given quantity. Again, when we say demand increases, we're shifting the entire curve. So when we shift the entire curve, we can see that at any given quantity, here's the equilibrium at the initial curve. If I take the same quantity and I go up to the new higher demand curve, I see that I would in fact be willing to pay more for the same quantity. So think about this for a moment. If I'm suggesting that at a given quantity, I now am willing to pay more for a particular good, this must mean that I want the good more, or that I'm demanding the good more. Now, this can happen for any number of reasons, and we'll discuss why here in just a second. But again, it's important for us to remember that when we're talking about demand increasing, what we mean is that for whatever reason, consumers in the market now want the good more. They literally are willing to pay more for the same amount of good as they were previously. And in many cases, we see that they actually buy more of the good as a result. So let's talk about what will actually shift the demand curve. We have four basic reasons why the demand curve will shift. The demand curve can shift because of consumer tastes, the price of a substitute good, price of a complement good, or the expected price of a good. Now, we can probably come up with more reasons, but a lot of them can be filtered down into one of these four categories. When we say consumer taste, we simply mean how much do consumers enjoy the good. A really good example of a good that's seen its consumer taste rise over time is quinoa. 15 years ago, I had never heard of the good quinoa. It was really nowhere to be found. I'm sure you had some fringe health food nuts that really were probably all over quinoa back in the late 90s, early 2000s. But it was really something that we saw come on the market around 2008, 2009, and now it's sort of everywhere. But you can think about the fact that, before people knew what quinoa was, they certainly couldn't demand it. But then as people started to realize all its different uses and its health aspects, the consumers now developed more of a taste for it. And so what we can think about this as an increase in demand. So we can say that the market demand for quinoa rose over time. And what this means is that more quinoa is purchased and the price of quinoa rises. Now, if we think about the price of a substitute good, so a really good example here is, let's think about Coke versus Pepsi. So if we're talking about the market for, say, Coke, and we think about the price of a substitute Pepsi rising, then this would mean that people will buy less Pepsi and buy more Coke. Substitute goods simply mean that I'm willing to substitute away from a good for another good. So Coke and Pepsi, you can think about even steak and chicken, blue cars, red cars. So it's just something that you would buy either or of, but you wouldn't buy together. So you wouldn't normally buy both Coke and Pepsi. You would buy one or the other. And so when we think about the price of a substitute going up, this would mean that we would demand more of a good. So if the price of Pepsi rises, we demand more Coke, and so the demand curve would shift out and to the right. A price of a complement good, so this would be a good that you bought normally at the same time. The classic example of complement goods are peanut butter and jelly. So if the price of jelly were to fall, so let's say jelly got cheaper, then we would expect people to buy more peanut butter. So we'd in fact expect the market demand for peanut butter to increase if the price of jelly were to fall. Now, a pretty unique example of a demand shifter comes in the form of expected price. Now, this is pretty straightforward when you get a handle for it, but at first it can be a little confusing. So when we say expected price, we mean what will the price of this good be in the future? So, for example, let's say that you're in the market for a laptop and you want to buy a new one, and you're kind of sort of looking at the prices, and you read online that you think that the price of laptops will increase in the future for any particular reason. What this is going to cause you to do is buy the computer now. So if we expect the price of computers to be higher or to rise in the future, then I want to buy that computer now. So we say that if the expected price rises for the good, then demand will increase now. Now, on the opposite side, for demand increases, we can basically think of any of these positive or demand increasing examples and just think about the opposite. So for whatever reason people think less of a good, then we expect the demand for that good to fall over time. So a good example of consumers losing their taste for a good are cigarettes. So people just don't buy cigarettes as much as they used to, largely because of the realization of the health risks, so on and so forth. If the price of a substitute were to fall, so if, in other words, if we're thinking about the market for Coke now, if the price of Pepsi were to fall, then we expect people to demand more Pepsi and substitute away from Coke. And so we would expect the market demand for Coke, in fact, to fall if the price of Pepsi were to decrease. If the price of a complement good were to rise, so go back to our peanut butter and jelly example, if the price of jelly were to rise, then we would expect people to buy less peanut butter. And again, this is just from our notion of when goods are commonly purchased together. And again, empirically we can see that when the price of a complement rises, we do tend to see consumers buying considerably less of a good. And then lastly, if the expected price. So if I think the expected price of a good is going to be lower in the future for any given reason, then I will decrease my demand for the good now, and I will wait for the price to drop. So a good example of this would be something like a tax-free weekend, or basically where the implicit price of something is going to be lower in a weekend where we decide we're not going to collect sales taxes. We often do this before the school year. And so if I expect the price of school supplies to be lower at some point in the future, I'm not going to purchase the school supplies now. So in fact, the demand for school supplies will fall now, and then later on will increase as the expected price does fall. Now the supply side is a little bit more straightforward, again because the supply side is largely based on the notion of cost. So When we think about supply, it's important to remember that the supply curve represents willingness to accept. So a firm has a particular willingness to accept for the price of their good. And again, this is largely from cost. So how much it costs a producer to produce a good is going to put them onto particular places in the supply curve. So the producers down here in the lower left-hand portion of the supply curve have low cost of production. So that's why they're willing to offer the goods for a cheap price. Those producers that are in the upper right-hand portion of the supply curve, they have high production cost. This is why they are unwilling to offer low prices for their goods. So when we think about what shifts supply, again, what we're thinking about is what would increase producers' willingness to supply their good. And we can sort of think about it again, just like we did with demand. If I pick a particular price, or excuse me, a particular quantity, Q star, and I were to take this up to my original supply curve, I can see that my willingness to accept is P star. If I take the same Q star and I take it up to now my new supply curve, my increased supply, as it shifted from S to S prime, I can see on this new supply curve, producers are willing to offer the good for a much lower price than P star originally. And so what this means is that if supply were to increase, then producers are more willing to offer the good than they were previously. And the reasons why that we might see a supply shift are pretty basic. So technology. If the technology improves for a company, they usually get faster at making their good. And so you can think about if technology improves, this is going to push the supply of that particular good out from S to S prime in this direction. A good example of this is the cotton gin. So prior to the cotton gin, it was a relatively arduous task to pick cotton. And then when the cotton gin was invented, this drastically increased the efficiency of cotton production. And so you saw the shift from S to S prime in terms of cotton. Another reason why the supply may shift is because of cost. And if costs were to decrease, maybe because the supplier that I'm buying a good that I use in my production. So for example, if I am a computer manufacturer and I need to buy all of my individual components to make my computers, if the suppliers of my goods start selling their goods, what I use for my products, for lower price, then this would constitute a decrease in cost. And if costs are to be decreased, then this will increase my willingness to supply the good, and again we will shift from S to S prime. And then lastly, we also expect expected price to shift the supply curve. In this case, if I believe as a producer that the expected price for my good will fall in the future, this means that I'm going to want to supply as much as my good now to take advantage of the current relatively higher price than it will be in the future. So a really good example, and this comes in the form of computers. So right at the tail end of the 1990s, what we saw was an expectation that the price of computers would fall drastically as both the supply, there were just a lot more companies producing at the time, and the technology was really increasing. So the expected price of computers was expected to fall pretty fast. And what we saw at that time was a drastic increase in the number of computers, and so we definitely saw an increase of supply from S to S prime. Now on the negative supply shift, again, if we shift supply back, we move from S to S prime this direction, so back and to the left. And this would come from the rare occurrence of technology decreasing. Now, we don't often think about technology decreasing, but if, for example, you own a business in a war-torn country, and so post-war you may have access to less technology than you did prior to the war, so we would expect countries that sort of go through war to see supply shifts back into the left. If the cost for your production were to rise, so for example, if the price of oil rose and you used a lot of oil in the production of your goods, say if you're an airline company, or if you're a gas company and you obviously use oil explicitly, if oil increases in cost, then this means that you are now less willing to supply your good than you were previously, and we would expect a shift back into the left. And then maybe pretty straightforward at this point, if the expected price of your good were to rise in the future, then this would mean I'm less willing to supply the good now. I'm going to wait and then offer my good on the market when the price rises. and this would again cause the curve to shift from S to S prime. And as we can see when the supply curve shifts back, we expect less quantity and less price. And as long as you remember that the supply curve shifting is a result of a reduction or an increase in the willingness to accept a particular price, then you should be able to keep this notion of supply curve shifting either out and to the right or back and to the left pretty straight. We will, again, later on in the course, talk about the supply side of the market in much more detail, but for right now, it's important that we remember that it's based almost explicitly on cost. And so, in that way, it becomes a little bit of a simpler notion, a little bit of a simpler concept, and then later on we will complicate it. All right, and to wrap up the video, I wanted to show you how we can use simple supply and demand to show, in fact, a real-world price change. And in fact, in this particular supply and demand curve, I'm going to show you two price changes. So for right now, let's look at this pre-1999 supply and pre-1999 demand and the equilibrium that they form. We have an equilibrium pre-1999 quantity and an equilibrium pre-1999 price. And we don't need to put actual prices or actual quantities here. We can see what the demand curve would tell us what happened, and then we can sort of check this with the real world data. And so what happens between 1999 and 2000 is that globally we see a large increase in the demand for oil. As globalization and as sort of the relative affluence of the 1990s is spread around the world, we see a rather large increase in the demand for oil. So there's more cars being made, so we need more oil for more gasoline. There's more production globally, which obviously requires oil. We're shipping more goods around, both with land freight as well as air freight as well as sea freight, all of which involve oil. And so there was a pretty dramatic increase in demand over that time period. And if we look at the prices for oil at that time, we do see a pretty steady increase of price between 1999 and 2007. So during this time, we see an increase in price due to an increase in demand. So from around 1990 to 2007, demand increases steadily. During this time, due to various reasons, the supply curve, or the supply of oil rather, stays remarkably the same. This is largely because of the control that Western oil companies as well as OPEC have on the entire oil market. So basically, they spent a lot of the 80s and 90s extracting a lot of oil, and then in the 2000s they sat on that oil for a while, and so the supply of oil remained the same. Now we can see why they might want to do that. So if they keep supply of oil the same, then they can take advantage of this increase in demand, because now people are paying a higher price for oil. And so they're selling more and at a higher price. And so they didn't have much of a reason to increase supply. Okay, so now the second change happens from 1999 to 07 to 07 to 2014. And we can see the change here comes from a shifting out and to the right of our supply curve. So between 2007 and 2014, we see a pretty dramatic increase in the supply of oil. And this happens for two reasons. First off, because of concern over funding of terrorism and various other national security concerns, the U.S. starts really extracting its own oil. So we see large increases in oil extraction in the U.S. We see large increases in oil extraction in Canada, as well as off the shores of both Canada and the United States, as well as increases in the supply of oil coming from OPEC countries. In fact, if you can recall, last year there was in fact what we call a price war for oil. What we mean by a price war is that both Western and OPEC oil companies were pushing the supply of oil out. And as the supply of oil increases, what this causes is a reduction in price. So we can see that the price of oil falls from its 2007 price down to here in 2014. And this was due to both Western and OPEC oil companies increasing their supply. Now we call it a price war because both of them were pushing the supply out, and the price was falling. And as the price begins to fall, as we can see here, this means that oil companies are making less money. And this is something that normally we, as oil companies, would not want to do. But because Western oil companies felt they had quite a bit of market power, they felt like they could keep pushing the supply out, keep pushing the price down. OPEC thought the same thing. And as a result, we saw oil prices fall very low. In fact, quite low, quite lower than we saw in 2007. And so we actually saw a 2014 oil price that was quite low. Now, since then, we've seen the price of oil rebound quite a bit. But that maneuver, first from 1999 to 2007, and then from 2007 to 2014, can be completely shown in a very simple supply and demand curve. And then we can check this with the data, and we can in fact see that from 99 to 07, we saw an increase in the price of oil, and then from 99 to 2014, we saw a decrease in the price of oil. And we'll probably see these shifts over time. Again, the price of oil is quite volatile, so we can expect it. Now, it's important to remember that these are sort of average moves. And what I mean by that is that, in fact, if you go back and look at the data between 2007 and 2014, you'll see the price of oil rises over that time period. And we could draw even more supply curves to sort of reflect that. And so when I say from 2007 to 2014, I really mean sort of where we ended up eventually. So at the end of 2014, we have supply of oil really far out, and the price of oil was quite low by historical standards. And now one other point I want to make that I forgot here was that you may ask yourself, why does demand stay relatively the same from 99 to 2007, and then after that sort of remain there? And so what we mean by this is that from 99 to 2007, the demand curve shifted up, and then from 2007 to 2014, basically the demand curve stays the same. And the reason why was because of the recession. So because of the global recession in 2000 that began in 2007 through 2008, 2009, the demand for oil just basically sort of stayed the same. And what I mean by that is population growth over that time dictated more goods be purchased, but because the global demand was sort of on a hiatus because of the recession, it sort of made it appear as if demand just sort of remained there over time, when in reality it was just sort of an example of a lot more people, but a bad economy sort of keeping demand from increasing as we would expect it to do if there hadn't been, say, a recession. And so the reason why demand sort of stays there is because of the recession. And then what we are seeing recently, sort of after this particular graph, is in fact that the price of oil is now increasing again, and this is largely because of the demand side. So the supply side has been pulled back a little bit. So OPEC and Western oil companies have ended the price war, and we're seeing supply now being restricted a little bit, so the price of oil is rising as the supply shifts back into the left. And also at the same time, we see demand increasing for oil, because as the global economy starts to improve a little bit, starts to heat up, especially due to the American economy, then we expect demand for oil is going to increase. And so this is why you've seen the price of gasoline increase recently, and that's why the price of gasoline was lower last year, was because of that price war, and that's why the price of gasoline rose very quickly from 2000 to 2007, was because of the supply and demand for oil. And so we can always sort of turn to supply and demand to give ourselves rough estimates of what we think are going to happen to price and quantity. And again, despite its relative simplicity, we find it to be a very useful way and correct way often to think about markets.